Welcome to Around the Empire. Today we have a great panel: Peter Castagno, Gumby, myself, Robbie Martin, and Dan Wright. This is a panel discussion about the questions that are still unanswered 20 years after 9/11. This is part 2 of an ongoing series, the Questions Still Unanswered series. And today we're going to talk about the anthrax attacks. And we are really honored to have such a knowledgeable and talented lineup in this panel. Myself and Dan Wright, we are the co-founders of Around the Empire. Peter Castagno is the co-owner of Citizen Truth. It's an independent media website covering international politics. He's an independent writer and a researcher with an MA in international conflict resolution. Gumby is an independent researcher. He's well known for his research threads on Twitter and podcast appearances under the pseudonym Gumby for Christ. That's a handle he chose years ago in jest, but it has become a brand. Robbie Martin is a documentary filmmaker. See his film, A Very Heavy Agenda, at veryheavyagenda.com. He's a musician, a researcher, and the host of MediaRoots Radio, which you can find on SoundCloud. Welcome, everybody. This is part 2 of our Questions Still Unanswered series. Today, we're going to talk about the anthrax attack, which there's so much to it. It may end up being more than one. I'm not sure, but we're really happy to have everyone here on the panel. We have Robbie Martin, we have Dan Wright, we have Peter Castagno, and we have Gumby. So thanks so much, everybody, for coming back on the podcast, and thanks for joining us for this one, Robbie. Great to see you. I'm just really happy to have everybody.
It's great to be back on.
All right, so Robbie, we were thinking it's been 20 years, right? And it's October, and this is 20 years ago today. This story was, it was pretty much embroiling the whole nation. But, a lot of people maybe don't remember, maybe aren't old enough to remember. So we thought maybe we'd go over some of the basics of the story. As I did before with part 1 of this, there'll be probably a very long list of links in the show notes of different videos, documents, stories, and things like that for your reference as well, because you'll probably want to dig into this a little bit more after this episode. So, we'll provide that as well. But I think it would be a good idea if we just do a little bit of a recap on what happened 20 years ago in October, and, what the basics of the story are. And Robbie, if you'd be willing to do that, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. So, it's known today as the Amerithrax attacks. It basically was a biological terrorist attack. You could accurately call it that was following 9/11, that happened less than a month after 9/11. And when I say it happened less than a month after 9/11, the first victim in these series of attacks, Robert Stevens, a photo editor for American Media Incorporated in Florida, died from inhalation anthrax on October 5th. And by the time this happened, of course, the media was already in such a hysteria and a fervor after 9/11 that their immediate, sort of reaction to it was, this is bioterrorism. And the Bush administration, for some reason, wouldn't say it was bioterrorism for the first couple of days. They sent out Tommy Thompson and said, well, maybe this guy, drank some infected water from a stream, and this is how he got anthrax. But then what eventually happened is they started finding letters that had real anthrax in them that was sent to different people in the media, the New York Post, Tom Brokaw, and 2 people in the Senate, Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. And they found, basically, law enforcement, CDC, EPA, FBI, they found weaponized anthrax spores. They believe they were weaponized, manufactured in some kind of high-grade form in these letters that were sent to these politician and media officials. And a bunch of other people got infected and died as a result of these letters, they say. Now, the way the FBI and official investigators have always framed this is that the anthrax came from these letters, although they don't really have any evidence exactly how Robert Stevens died from inhalation anthrax. They don't have evidence of how one of the victims, Kathy Nguyen, died from anthrax. But this was sort of used as a way to pivot us from like this idea that Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden attacked us on 9/11 to Iraq. And I think if you have to go back to the very beginning of this, because eventually the Bush administration used this sort of all-encompassing term of WMDs to describe this potential nuclear weapons program that Saddam had, to chemical weapons, sarin gas that he might have, to potential biological weapons. This sort of umbrella term. But the very beginning, the Bush administration used the term WMDs basically as a metonym for anthrax. And it essentially, very early on, as these attacks were happening and as people were dying from anthrax right after 9/11, the Bush administration used that term WMD basically to mean anthrax. Now, what was really clever, I think, is the Bush administration never directly came out and said they thought that Saddam Hussein was behind this attack. They just let other neoconservatives who were like basically best friends with some of the people in the Bush administration go out there and say that. Yet the FBI really early on, as early as November 2001, put out a psychological profile of who they believe to be the killer. And the psychological profile implies an insider of the US government. So you simultaneously had FBI agents, saying that we think it's an insider. It's a lonely white guy who has science expertise. You already have FBI agents leaking to the media that it's AIM strain, which means it's the American, sort of bioweapon version of anthrax. But then you have the Bush administration sort of subtly hinting that it could be Iraq and it's part of some larger terrorist attack that could have to do with 9/11. And then that sort of, fuel was used eventually by Colin Powell as we get into Iraq, when he does his famous UN speech. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And I don't know if I did a great job encapsulating all of it. If there's anything I missed, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, we can fill in some details. We, Dan and I live in New Jersey, and sort of this is where it began. We were talking a little bit before the podcast, and I was talking about how I just went over some of the local stories on this. And so supposedly the letters were mailed on Nassau Street in Princeton, which is right in the middle of the university area. And as you can see, Trenton is just not too far. That's, I don't know, maybe a 10-mile distance to a little bit to the southeast. And then you can see Hamilton Township, which is where they found anthrax in a lot of post offices. But mainly they call the Hamilton Township hub, a big distribution center, they call it the ground zero of the anthrax attacks, because I guess these letters were processed through Hamilton. That distribution center was shut down for 4 years, actually. And I believe 4 post office workers from there were affected. Nobody died in New Jersey, surprisingly, but really because the mayor of Hamilton Township ordered a whole bunch of Cipro and antibiotics and gave it to all the postal workers in that area early on, which is probably has something to do with why people didn't get that sick. But this is kind of where it started, where these letters were supposedly mailed and processed on September 18th. So I'll just throw that in there.
Yeah, and I should just specify to people that there were 2 batches of letters, of known letters. And I say known letters because what's interesting about the death of Robert Stevens is the FBI actually doesn't even confirm that he died from a letter in their final executive summary. They just say it appears that a letter arrived to the AMI building and a contemporaneous anthrax outbreak occurred in the AMI building. That's their, like, pretty much their exact wording in their report. So in essence, after all their swabbing tests, after all they did to go back to this first anthrax crime scene, their best evidence is that there were spores found in a mail crate and in the mail truck that used to come to AMI, and then some residual, very microscopic spores found around Florida post offices. But what's interesting is, I mean, they really have no evidence to suggest that someone didn't walk in a letter, because the spores could have come from one of those sort of shared mail crates that offices take from a postal truck, pass around the office, bring back to the truck. So basically all their evidence shows is that there's some spores going from some trucks into some post offices to the building. But I guess what I'm saying is the FBI has always just shown us these 4 letters because they claim they never found the 5th letter. But they sort of brush that aside in general. They don't really talk about Robert Stevens' death much at all. But it was these 4 letters sent in 2 batches. The first batch was sent out on September 18th, supposedly from New Jersey. And the second batch was actually sent out sometime around, let me make sure I got this correctly. I'm not exactly sure when the second batch of real letters were sent out.
I think I have a timeline here. It says September 18th, postal facility in Hamilton Township processes anthrax laced letters to NBC News in New York and the New York Post. October 5th, Bob Stevens, photo editor at Florida tabloid The Sun, dies from inhalational anthrax.
Yeah.
October 9th, Hamilton Township facility processes anthrax letters to then Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle and Senator Patrick Leahy.
Yeah.
Both letters have return address of a fictitious Greendale School in Franklin Park. Franklin Park's another town right in that vicinity.
Yeah, the 9th. So they were sent about, I don't know. So one batch was sent out on the 18th, and then the killer or killers waited, over 2 weeks to send the second batch out to Leahy and Daschle. Now the Leahy letter got sort of blocked in the mail. I guess by that time they had already stopped certain mail systems going to these places in DC. So Leahy's letter got held, and it wasn't found sometime until November something. But initially, the FBI was like, here's these 4 letters we have. It all looks like it's by the same person. The handwriting's similar. And even Robert Mueller actually went out on November 3rd, 2001, and said, we need the public's help to identify the handwriting in these letters. This might be a clue to who the killer is. And he shows the pictures of the letters that they had at the time. Now, what's really fascinating is there's someone named Barbara Hatch Rosenberg who put together a timeline of anthrax sometime around 2002, a very long time ago. She put this together. And I hadn't seen this until really recently. But what her timeline does versus all the other ones that are out there is she actually includes another group of 4 letters that was sent from St. Petersburg, Florida, that was not sent from New Jersey. And this had been reported on. This is all confirmed by reports in the media. There was reports in the New York Times about these St. Petersburg letters because they were sent one. And the reason why these 4 letters from St. Petersburg are important is because they appear to be written in complete coordination with whoever the killer or killers were who sent out the New Jersey letters. The timing suggests they were written in coordination, and the targets also suggest they were written in coordination, because here's why. The September 18th real anthrax letters that were sent out from New Jersey to NBC and the New York Post, those letters were sent postmarked September 18th. 2 more letters were sent from St. Petersburg, Florida on September 20th to NBC and the New York Post. Both of these letters contained fake anthrax. And what's interesting about these letters is they contain threats that weren't directly about 9/11. They were a little more wacky. And they even had Russian characters in them to almost make it seem like they were written by a Russian person.
It's before anybody knows anything about it. It's
Exactly.
not public, right?
This is September 20th. Remember, Robert Stevens' death is on the 5th. That's the first time the media is aware or has any inkling of another bioterrorist attack, an anthrax attack. September 20th, these hoax letters were sent out. Then what's crazy is before the Leahy and Daschle letter was sent out on October 9th, you have another pair of hoax letters sent out from St. Petersburg, Florida. And these hoax letters were mailed out on the day that Stevens died. So it's almost as if the killer or whoever's coordinating in this effort was sort of basing their timing around some of the actual deaths as well. So on October 5th, St. Petersburg mailing of 2 more hoax letters to Howard Troxler, a journalist who writes for the St. Petersburg Times, and Judith Miller of the New York Times. Now, Judith Miller actually opening up her hoax letter from St. Petersburg that had talcum powder in it is sort of the visual image that we were most influenced by as a culture about how the anthrax attacks unfolded, I would argue, because her description in the New York Times is of a talcum powder substance, which was not real anthrax, floating into the air like a cloud and seeming almost aerosolized. That's the classic image that we were sort of scared by about the anthrax attacks. This was so fine and weaponized that it floats into the air like a cloud and you breathe it in. But what's weird is the actual anthrax that arrived at NBC News and these other places was not refined enough to be like a cloud that would float in the air. It was the hoax letter that Judith Miller got that sort of created that image in the public culture. And what's crazy, this is actually one of the weirdest things about this whole timeline, is the first anthrax infection that got reported in the news and that was actually reported to the FBI. The person who received a hoax letter at NBC News on September 25th notified the FBI because in that letter it had talcum powder and it was making threats. She notified the FBI. For some reason, they didn't come out until 2 days later. But right after this NBC News employee opened this hoax letter from St. Petersburg on September 25th, she started getting sick and went to the hospital. And the FBI comes back and says, well, this letter didn't test positive for anthrax, but your hospital results tested positive for anthrax. So what happened here? Do you remember any other letter? And she's like, you know what? I do remember another letter, but I didn't think it was as important as this letter that I showed you guys. She goes and finds it. And this letter ends up being the real anthrax letter that we see, that the FBI shows us now, sent to NBC News, Tom Brokaw. And in this letter, apparently pours out a little bit of sandy substance. So a sandy-like substance is actually apparently what infected her with skin anthrax. But she thought it was the hoax anthrax letter that did. So that's how the timing of this was. The hoax letter actually initiated the initial call to the FBI that there was anything being sent through the mail that could be a biological attack. But then they later go back and find the real letter, and that sort of affirms this idea that there is a real anthrax attack happening, even though a hoax is what kicked off them looking into it in the first place. So I guess the point to all this is that, to me, this throws the entire case against the eventual perp that they tried to pin this on out the window, because they can barely account for him, Bruce Ivins, going to New Jersey to send out the letters the 2 different times they say he did. He lived in Frederick, Maryland. That's about a 7.5-hour round trip. They can barely account for that missing time. How are they going to account for missing time, 29-hour round trip to Florida from Frederick, Maryland? And I say this because it looks like the same handwriting. You can see a letter, one of these hoax letters written to Howard Troxler, and it looks to me like it's written by someone it looks similar handwriting. So I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest here that these were either written in coordination or even by the same group or single person, just based on even just the handwriting appearance of the envelope. Hoax letter versus real letter.
Let's just real quick brush over the timeline too, just to frame this out, the rest of it.
Sure.
So we get to middle of October, and so October 9th, I'm not sure, when do they actually receive those letters in the Senate? Daschle.
15th was the Daschle one, and then a month after is when they eventually found the held Leahy letter.
And then the 16th is when the Senate closes. The 17th, the House shuts down. The 18th, the Hamilton post office facility shuts down. And and then people start dying, I guess. Other than the Florida case, October 21st is when the Washington Post Office is the Brent. What's the name of the Washington Post Office? Brentwood, right? The postal workers there are the ones who get really, really sick. And on the 21st, Thomas Morris Jr. dies. On the 22nd, Joseph Cursine dies. And then a week later, October 31st, Kathy Nguyen, is that how you pronounce that? Worked in a New York City hospital supply room, died. And then
say something?
Yeah, sure.
Look at the Barbara Hatch Rosenberg timeline. She confirms this also. It's on her timeline, and she did this all the way back in August 2002. She's the one who included the hoax St. Petersburg letters in her timeline. And she says, Kathy Nguyen, no source found. And this is actually affirmed in the later, I think, 2010 FBI summary. Presumed cross-contamination of mail, even though no evidence is found. Although clinical observations suggest a large initial dose. So this is the most mysterious anthrax victim who died of them all, I think, died from a very large initial dose of inhalation anthrax, yet they could find no spores anywhere around her. I mean, so this one, I think, is one of the, I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. It's just never.
Yeah. And I'll add all these timelines too to this video so that the audience can hear that. Yeah, that's weird. And then I'll just add that there's another incident that generally doesn't show up in any timelines, but our post office here, we have a big regional distribution center, and it's called Belmar, New Jersey. It's not the Belmar at the shore, New Jersey. It's a different Belmar, just outside of Philadelphia, Bellmawr. And there was a worker who had a cutaneous type injury that and I believe that on the 13th of October was when that was first reported. And on Halloween, they shut down the Belmar distribution center here. And they said that they found some anthrax on one of the sorting machines. That worker tested positive for the Belmar, New Jersey, Southern New Jersey. That worker tested positive with an antigen test, an antibody test, but the CDC then ruled it as not being a case of anthrax. So they ruled it out, but they did shut down this post office for a period of time as well, even though you don't see those kinds of things. They shut it down a week later on November 7th. So I'm going to just kind of insert that into the timeline too. The Belmar post office was closed.
And I think that that's notable too, what you found, because it looks like they originally counted it in their tally of 23 and then removed it. And they also actually did this, interestingly enough, with Ernesto Blanco, the second, or actually technically the first known anthrax infection ever in this whole timeline. He was an AMI employee. He was the mailroom guy there. And the CDC refused to say he had anthrax until like December or something. And so he was just getting treated. He almost died, actually.
Wow.
In the hospital. But now they count him. And that's a weird thing. I mean, just throwing this out there, when I was doing that map project, if some people listening to this also saw the Whitney Webb broadcast from a few days ago, Robert Cadlick, oddly enough, lived or has a Florida property like right around the corner from Ernesto Blanco, and I just thought that was rather creepy. I mean, I'm not saying that means anything, but just weird things like that have come up into the map project.
There's a lot of weird things in that map project, and we highly recommend that. And I'm going to link it. I'll put it near the top of the show notes. Just 2 days ago, Robbie did an interview with Whitney Webb, and definitely go and watch that, because there's whole other aspects of this that you can get, including his visual map project of the weird things that happen in Florida and the locations and vicinities and, that kind of thing, not only for anthrax, but also just from 9/11 as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Robbie, that was really something. I'm shocked nobody did that before this, or if they did, it didn't,
It's been done partially. I based it off of an idea someone else had done with the Israeli art students in the 9/11 addresses, but not, yeah. I took it much further than they did, but there's been
Glad you did it.
amounts of that before.
Should we skim through the rest of the timeline just before we dig into the other things? Just to sort of.
Ottilie Lundgren. That was the last death.
Okay. Yeah. So, what parts of that do you want to? What the whole Florida thing doesn't seem to fit in with everything else.
Well, it doesn't unless you sort of try to reverse engineer what happened with Stephen Hatfill. Because there's some interesting clues, I think. And I'll let Gumby talk about, there's a lot more stuff with Florida and AMI because, there's a whole tabloid, kind of element to it, a Rupert Murdoch wannabe who had some weird leverage and all this. But yeah, there's a weird passage in a Washington Post writer's book about the anthrax attacks. And I've never seen this anywhere else. So this is really intriguing to me after I found out about these St. Petersburg letters. Apparently the FBI actually went back to, actually initiated their search on Stephen Hatfill. And I say initiated their search on Florida properties he had, specifically a storage container, based on the St. Petersburg letters. This was where the FBI was going in terms of their investigation of Stephen Hatfill. So somehow those St. Petersburg letters, at least to the FBI at the time, seemed to imply his guilt or lead them in his direction. Now, there's also more evidence to back that theory up. Don Foster of Vanity Fair also implies that he had access to all these other hoax letters, that he had copies of them. The one sent to Tom Brokaw, that he had seen one of the other ones, that he'd seen even the one sent to Howard Troxler. The only one that we can still see that's online right now is the envelope that was sent to Howard Troxler. That's what I'm comparing the handwriting to the real letters. That looks similar to the real letters. But the St. Petersburg letters, the Stephen Hatfill connection is that Don Foster believed that he matched it up. According to him, and I have fear of getting sued since Stephen Hatfill already did a $6 million settlement with the government. I'm not trying to read between the lines of what he said, but it seems like he's saying that he had samples of Stephen Hatfill's handwriting, and he thought that the hoax letters with the real letters together looked like Hatfill. Now, I'm not saying that. I think there's weird things in here that almost seems like people were trying to set up Hatfill. But that's interesting that the St. Petersburg letter plays into that there, that the FBI was taking it seriously at some point. So the fact that that's been so heavily omitted now, I think, is rather interesting. And maybe Hatfill's lawsuit has something to do with why we're never, it's so hard to find that and so hard to see those letters. I have no.
And I would, throw out a few more things about Stephen Hatfill. He's got a very, very dark history. He this is somewhat disputed, although it seems pretty likely that he was at least working with them. But he was in Rhodesia during the War of Independence, what's now Zimbabwe. They were fighting against the white minority controlled government. And that's, I believe, where he went to medical school. And he also made up a fake PhD that became a controversy at some time. But he apparently served with the Selous Scouts. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, SELOUS, who are known to have conducted biowarfare attacks. At the very least, they dumped cholera into the drinking water supply. They also carried out false flag bombings of churches and all kinds of just heinous activity, just random beatings and torture of prisoners and that sort of thing. They're also probably linked to an anthrax attack that happened in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia at the time. And Merrill Nass investigated this and published a pretty detailed paper showing, I think, pretty conclusively, although it's still disputed, that they were behind this anthrax attack that poisoned, I don't know, something like hundreds of people in Zimbabwe at the time. And he ends up getting involved with the U.S., quote unquote biodefense program, and working at U.S. Amrit. Although he actually wasn't at U.S., he had stopped working at U.S. Amrit in like 1999 or something like that. But there are details in the FBI report that show you why everybody was so suspicious of him, because he had gone to his like personal pharmacist in like May of 2001 and gotten multiple prescriptions for Cipro. And this is at a time when he's not even supposedly working in the bio warfare realm. And even if he was, this is his own personal physician that he apparently requested specifically the physician to give him a prescription to get on Cipro. So that was anyway, just a little tangent on Hatfill, who ends up, like Robbie kind of alluded to, he was the first quote unquote person of interest in the anthrax case. John Ashcroft gets on TV and calls him that. And there are several articles that are written that point the finger at him. Nick Kristof in the New York Times and Don Foster in Vanity Fair, as Robbie mentioned, which was republished in Reader's Digest in a condensed form. And so Hatfill fights back pretty strongly against all of that with like a slew of lawsuits that he files. He sues the federal government. He sues the New York Times. He sues Vanity Fair. He sues Don Foster personally. I believe he may have sued Nick Kristof personally.
In there somewhere too.
Who was?
Reader's Digest, I think he sued.
Yes, Reader's Digest, because they had run the Vanity Fair piece. And he gets that, I mean, he wins basically all of these suits. He gets a massive payout from the federal government. He gets Vanity Fair and Reader's Digest to retract the story completely, which Robbie, I know, had some personal experience with, because he paid for access to the Vanity Fair archive for like an old scan of the magazine where the story had run.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
That's why it wasn't there for you you paid to have the article. I saw that tweet. So you paid to have the article, but the reason it's not there, even though it was published, is because they were forced to retract it as part of the lawsuit?
I think so. That seems to be the settlement.
Oh, okay.
And what's sadly, I thought, based on the content of the article, that Don Foster had put a photograph of more of these St. Petersburg hoax letters in his article. But it turns out that's not the case. Although, what's just funny side story, I ordered an archive copy of the Vanity Fair article, and the mail got lost in the mail. It's like, I mean, rarely happens.
They're putting some pattern in first for you.
But yeah, I didn't get my copy, so I'm gonna have to order another one to see if there's actually anything beyond.
Stuck in transit, it's being scanned.
You mean like hard copy off of eBay, that kind of thing?
I found it. It's got a glistening Clooney shirtless photo on the cover. You know, I needed a copy of it.
At any rate, so yeah, Hatfill, I mean, wins all of these lawsuits, and basically, I mean, as much as you possibly could, goes from being suspect number one to clearing his name. I mean, effectively, despite having really some pretty shady ties. And Don Foster alleges that if you map out the mailings and the timeline, that it follows, there's some phrase that he uses, like follows Hatfill like a vapor trail or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I'm guessing there's got to be some connection. There's another clue also that the FBI was at a Cipro manufacturing plant looking into clues about Hatfill when they decided to go back to the AMI building. And I'll let you finish, Gumby, because I know you have a lot more to say about Hatfill probably.
Yeah, well, that was most, I think, of what I had on Hatfill, other than that he kind of, he won his lawsuits, and then he kind of, collected his money and seemed to kind of disappear. There's a Newsweek article from around 2010 where he is just involved in some really weird stuff. He bought some property in Puerto Rico and was like, basically like some kind of paramilitary training camp that he was trying to start in Puerto Rico that may have, I'm not sure if it ever ended up happening or not. And I think he founded that with a guy who had been involved in the Cella Scouts, or maybe multiple people who had been involved in the Cella Scouts, this Rhodesian, military unit. And also co-wrote a paper with a guy who definitely was involved in the Cella Scouts and is still like in a pro-Rhodesian organization. So, obviously very, racist overtones there. And then kind of reemerges in November 2019, note the date, with a book about the oncoming imminent flu pandemic that we're all going to be subject to, and how the U.S. is woefully unprepared in such a case. And he starts giving some interviews in like January of 2020 to mostly right-wing outlets. He goes on Steve Bannon's podcast a lot in that time frame, kind of ringing the bell about an oncoming pandemic that's going to happen. So I won't go too far into that stuff, but that's just sort of interesting to note on Hatfill. And once he falls out as a suspect, as probably a lot of people know, the FBI points the finger at Bruce Ivins, who's this U.S. AMRID anthrax scientist, and it takes a really long time, and it's like the most expensive investigation in FBI history that they eventually put out, kind of fart out this report on Bruce Ivins and why, the supposedly evidence against him, which is fairly weak. I think most would agree. And a lot of even what was in that report has kind of fallen apart. The strongest individual element of the case, I guess, is that they had supposedly taken the Dashel, I think it was the Dashel anthrax, and they had traced it to this flask that they had found in his personal lab. And that if you did some genetic testing, it like had to have come from this flask, or almost certainly did, or something. And that's been completely disputed by the Federation of American Scientists. Did a study where I guess the FBI had hired like multiple different firms to do studies on this. And the FAS, the Federation of American Scientists, took a look back at it and found there was no way of like coordinating between the different studies, and that if you looked at the evidence, there was like a high negative fail rate for the testing being the same. I don't know all the science here, so I'm not getting the details right, but people can look into that. But essentially, the strongest piece of their case had fallen apart pretty strongly, and they had no motive. I mean, the motive was that Bruce Ivins was obsessed with a sorority and was kind of an unusual guy, and that he drove all the way from Frederick, Maryland, where he lived, up to Princeton, New Jersey, because he wanted to harass the sorority that was at Princeton. There are other theories that were kind of floated around out there that maybe it had something to do with the anthrax vaccine, which he had worked on and was getting a lot of bad press at the time for potentially being linked to Gulf War syndrome, and that by sending all this anthrax out there, whipping up a bunch of fear, it would redound to his benefit because they would put money back into the anthrax vaccine program or something like that. But
it's all real quick.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because I always didn't follow it that closely. So what was the connection? Like he was upset about some sorority in Princeton. What does that have to do with mailing anthrax laden letters to like Tom Daschle or Brian Williams or Tom Brokaw, excuse me? Like, what is the point? What's the connection to that?
There's not really, other than that I think they just label it as obsessive behavior in the FBI report, and that he
wouldn't he be obsessed when he mailed it to the sorority people if he was?
Well, yeah, that's what you would think. I think the idea is that he was like obsessed with the sorority, and so he goes up to harass the Princeton chapter, And then, oh, by the way, I'm also going to mail anthrax to.
But like
It
they
puts
would,
him in the right spot.
but that's
Puts
not
him-
even like John Hinckley crazy, where he thinks he's gonna like impress Jodie Foster by shooting Reagan, right? Like this is, they would never know he did that.
Right.
No, they say he's a stalker. They say he was a stalker, and
Mhm.
the only evidence I've been able to find that he was somehow interested in the sorority is there is like an old Yahoo News mailing list that apparently is Bruce Ivins' alias. There's like 3 different email addresses that, if you look at all these different random official documents, you can sort of find some digital footprint of who apparently Bruce Ivins was posting under these 3 aliases online. I mean, there is some evidence, let's just say, to suggest that Bruce Ivins was a weird guy. I mean, he definitely made a bizarre impression at the workplace, but that's not, it's like, that's how their circumstantial case is so weak that they really, really lean into this idea that he was like a mentally ill stalker. And the
Right.
stalker angle, I think, answers your question, Daniel, about like why they're saying like he's even going to this post office location at all. Like, you know, even though he was immaculate, there were no spores found anywhere on his person and on his work area and his home, that somehow he slipped up and he was just such an obsessive stalker of the sorority that he couldn't help himself and went there to send the letters, even though there was a location about 20 minutes away from his house of the same sorority branch, apparently. So that also,
that doesn't fun. So it looks like they're basically saying, and this happens with law enforcement sometimes. It's just like, all right, look, we just need to smear the hell out of this guy, hit him with everything, any kind of dirt you have, kind of like an Oppo dump, like a Steele dossier, if you will. Just like anything we've heard, anything bad. But I'm saying just like a theory of the case. Like, I'm really obsessed with this sorority. Okay, so I did this terrible famous thing, and now I'm famous and they'll love me. Like, that's the kind of demented logic of a John Hinckley or somebody, or other people who do crazy stuff for attention. But like this, he's obsessed with the sorority, mails letters, never takes credit, like, it doesn't even make any sense within its own.
Yeah, I think the FBI report mostly labels that as like obsessive behavior, showing that he's a crazy guy, and then the motive is some very vague thing about the vaccine program and how if he sends out a bunch of anthrax, it's going to reignite the vaccine program because he was afraid of losing his job or something to that effect.
The letter pretending to be a Islamist extremist is also bizarre in that context, saying death to the U.S. and Israel.
Right.
yeah.
I don't.
The FBI at first, I don't know exactly who said it, but the term super patriot was used to describe what was one of the motives behind Bruce Ivins, that he was like inspired so much by the neocon atmosphere that he wanted to sort of be a super patriot and sort of create his own
mailing letters.
Yeah, but then I mean, what's funny about that is they also actually in the FBI executive summary used quotes and things he said about Israel to link him to the letters, because there is sort of a Zionist component to it too. They're not just implying he's a super patriot. They're also implying he's sort of like an ultra Zionist at points. Now there's other information that's been out there to suggest he was like talking about his own Judaism a lot and things like that. But the FBI actually will touch on that to sort of bolster their case with the wording in the letters, like emails he sent to people about how much, we think we need to defend Israel and things like that. But then, there's a flip side to that, where in the same reports, you look at all the FBI files, they're saying that he would make off-color anti-Semitic jokes at work as well. So like, I mean, they're trying to paint him as this sort of like ultra-Zionist, really religious, Jewish man who was a super patriot, but then he's also making like anti-Semitic jokes at work and other files you can find. So the whole thing, I mean, yeah, you're right, Daniel. It is like it is basically like a Steele dossier, like Oppo research dump. And this is the best they could do. So I think that really shows how weak their case is.
Well, and what's funny too is that Maureen Stevens, the wife of Robert Stevens, who died, the AMI employee, sued the federal government as well as Battelle Memorial Institute and Bioport, alleging basically that they had some culpability in this. So regardless of what happened, the stock, the anthrax itself that killed her husband came from the U.S. stockpile, whether it was from U.S. AMRID or whether it was from Battelle, which is basically a subsidiary, subcontractor of the United States, that somebody, screwed up here because the anthrax got out and killed her husband. So she sues the government in like 2003 or 2004. The case drags on for forever, like 8 years or something. And she does finally get a settlement. I don't think the terms of that are disclosed, but presumably she got a payout for it. But one of the interesting things about that is that the US government ended up kind of having to argue against itself, in the sense that the FBI report on Bruce Ivins is kind of trying to make the case that, yes, he was kind of freelancing, doing his own thing, making anthrax in his own lab, and he, went in and sent it out. Whereas when the Department of Justice was trying to defend against this lawsuit,
they were fighting liability, right? They were saying they weren't liable.
So they had to make the basically opposite case and say that Bruce Ivins actually didn't have access to the drying machine that was necessary to produce this anthrax that was so, that was sent to Daschle, that was so dried out, it wasn't wet anthrax, and that was, what made it so deadly or whatever.
So they demolished their own case to protect against a big payout.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter at that point anyway, because Bruce Ivins was dead. He had, allegedly killed himself with taking a Tylenol overdose, and so
was he under investigation when that happened? Because I don't know the history.
He was, yeah.
I mean,
so he was like stressed out.
The FBI has basically, they've sort of tunneled our point of view into this false, frame where it makes it seem like they were looking at Bruce Ivins the whole time. If you go into their files, they really cherry pick and only show you stuff where they were looking, suspicions about him early on, even though he was actually helping them with the investigation because he was one of the experts in the country. He was helping them with the investigation for a very long time. And so when you look at their files now, it's all cherry picked to make it appear this way. And, we really don't know how much what they were seeing about Stephen Hatfill themselves that really made them suspicious. Most of that's just sort of whitewashed in their executive summary now, because they sort of have to admit, that they went after him and he didn't end up being the killer. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild.
So was the bottom line then for the general public here? The bottom line basically, like, first of all, no one's been convicted, obviously, because one of the suspects, not even clear the main one's dead, and the other one sued his way to them not touching him, or maybe because he's innocent, which maybe that's the case. So at the end of the day, this is an open case, right? There's for these 5 deaths and however many 17 people who were infected and injured, there's no actual 20 years later, there's been no one convicted, and there's no compelling case that they've got anyone who did it, right? So whoever did this is almost certainly, if they're alive for whatever reason, they're free.
The FBI would say they closed the case and that it was Bruce Ivins, right?
Yeah, they probably would, but I mean, I think that it's interesting. You said one suspect is dead, Daniel. Technically speaking, one of the very first people they looked at, who they polygraphed, a guy named Bill Patrick, is also dead. He passed a polygraph. He has almost more I don't know, more than Stephen Hatfill, but I think he was involved in mentoring Hatfill, and he's dead. So, I mean, I guess it's possible that there's people out there who have died who are involved in this, and there's people out there who are still alive and free. I mean, Rudy Giuliani is still alive, and he definitely was involved in covering this up. There's no doubt about that. So there's definitely people who I know who are still out there who had something to do with at least covering this up. But yeah, as far as the actual killers, it's sort of scary to think that whoever did this is probably still out there if they're not dead already.
I just wanted to mention real quick that there were doubts, even in real time, about the accusations against Ivins. And one person who had a lot of doubts was Rush Holt, who was a New Jersey congressman. In fact, he was the congressman in the district where this is all, in central Jersey, where this is all happening. So he had a keen interest. He had an interest in this subject for a whole lot of reasons. One is he lives in an area, it's central Jersey, but there are lots of people who worked in New York in that area, and there were certainly people not killed on 9/11 in that. It's where the anthrax letters were mailed, so I'm sure they were, crawling over that whole area trying to find out where they came from. Number 3 is there were anthrax spores found in his House congressional office in Washington, which I didn't know until recently. And also he called for sort of a reopening of this case. He doubted the FBI's case all along. So this was originally in 2011. And by the way, Rush Holt, he was also a scientist. He was a PhD physicist who served, I think, 8 terms, and he left office in 2015. So this is, in the thick of this, Rush Holt says that he's skeptical about the conclusions. And at this point in time, this is the spring of 2011. It says, while a panel of psychiatrists said this week that Bruce Ivins, the Maryland scientist believed by authorities to be behind several anthrax-laden letters in 2001, was, quote, psychologically disposed to undertake the mailings. Rush Holt maintains that the
psychologically disposed to undertake the mailings. God, is that thin?
Yeah, this is
What a thin claim.
Yeah, and you can kind of really see that from this article. So Rush Holt maintains the FBI hasn't proven its case. In a report released Wednesday, the panel of psychiatrists said its review of Ivins' sealed psychiatric records, quote, does support the Department of Justice determination that he was responsible. In the report, the panel wrote, quote, Dr. Ivins was psychologically disposed to undertake the mailings. His behavioral history demonstrated his potential for carrying them out and that he had the motivation and the means. So, I mean, that's really
he had
weak,
the motivation. What is it? That's based off the sorority thing?
Yeah,
when they say sealed psychological records, does that mean he had a therapist and they reviewed the therapist records? I didn't think that was allowed.
Looks that way.
The only thing it could, yeah.
At that time, Rush Holt says, I think this just adds a little more circumstantial evidence that Ivins was the culprit. I don't think it cinches the case. And he says, Holt added that after rushing to conclusions and naming Dr. Stephen Hatfill as a person of interest in the case in 2002, there was little reason to believe the veracity of the FBI's investigation into Ivins' role. He says, quote, if I hadn't personally witnessed the FBI make so many false steps and jump to so many conclusions, I'd be more willing to believe them. I watched as they hunted and harassed Hatfill for years only to decide that he had nothing to do with it. They jumped to a conclusion there. What's to prevent them from jumping to a conclusion with regard to Ivins? So he thinks that the evidence is flimsy and he thinks their history is flimsy. And then he actually called for a report. He called for a commission to be like a 9/11 style commission to be done on the anthrax attacks, which I don't think ever happened, but they did do some kind of an investigation. And right before he left office, I guess this report was released, and he said that, report requested by Holt found gaps in the FBI's investigation. So right up to the time he leaves office, he thinks that FBI investigation was really poorly done, not convincing, that kind of thing. So it's the Government Accountability Office reported that the FBI fell short in 3 of 6 characteristics needed to analyze scientific evidence. And, I'll put a link in there so people can look at the details. So just to emphasize that in real time, there were a lot of people thinking that this investigation against Ivins was pretty flimsy. People who had, reason to really want to know.
Yeah, and sorry, I had to run to the bathroom there, but I don't know if you mentioned Patrick Leahy also, who had a letter addressed to him that was, as Robbie mentioned, found like a month after it should have been delivered, I guess, to him. He questioned Robert Mueller directly because Mueller was briefing Congress or some subcommittee of Congress or something. And Leahy asked him pretty pointed questions and intimated pretty strongly that he believed that if Ivins was involved, he was not the only culprit, and that there were likely or quite possibly other people around, and kind of suggested that in his view, the case was still open. Whereas the FBI, I think maybe they did technically leave it open at some point, but I believe it's officially closed at some point since they released their investigation summary.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, and this is going to sound like a wacky theory, but it is sort of weird that John Ashcroft would blow the anthrax investigation so early on and just go out there and be like, yeah, this guy's a person of interest. I mean, that is going to open yourself up to lawsuits. So it is a little curious. And the more I think about it, the more I think that Stephen Hatfill's lawsuits have knocked out or created a black hole of information in this case that's sort of invisible, like the St. Petersburg letters. If people thought that it looked like Hatfill's handwriting, that makes sense why there are people in the FBI, narrowing in on him. But yeah, it's just kind of weird. It's like he sues the government, gets $6 million. John Ashcroft's, this punching bag. And apparently John Ashcroft actually went to the deposition for the Stephen Hatfill lawsuit against the U.S. government. And he sat there and said, I don't know, over 70 times, or I don't recall during the deposition. And apparently there's videotape of this somewhere.
In Hatfill's defense, John Ashcroft, that people probably have just completely banished him from their minds, was an idiot. I mean, He lost an election to a dead guy. But he actually was like kind of an idiot. Like I could actually see him. I mean, there's issues here for like opening about some sort of nefarious aspects, but like the narrative where he just said something really stupid and blew a $6 million hole in the federal government because he couldn't keep his mouth shut, like that rings true. That's not something I would dispute. He's really that kind of an idiot. But just to move past, let me just, before we move on, does anyone here think Ivins did it? Or anybody think that the FBI got the right guy? Because I don't, but does anybody else think so? Okay, no. Just before I was going to move on, I just wanted to, if there was.
I just want to say though, comment on that. I do think whoever did this wanted it not just to point to Islamic terrorists, even though that's how they frame the letters. They made it cartoonishly look like that. I do think whoever did this knew that it would point to a very small pool of suspects in like the biological weapons community. So I'll just throw that out there. But no, I don't think Ivins did it.
And the people around, the people who Hatfill hung around with, if you will, had, professional relationships with, would have been that group that would have been the first suspects just because of the subject knowledge. Not just because of the subject knowledge, because some of them were very upset when the bioweapons program was kind of shut down here or forced to go underground. Do I have that right?
Bill Patrick was very upset. He's like the kind of the granddaddy of all this. If we're looking at this like a very heavy agenda, he's like the Donald Kagan of all connections. So like
you might have to follow up on that, Robbie. You might have to take that somewhere.
Bill Patrick is this guy, and Whitney Webb's covered this extensively.
Yeah.
Do these crazy demonstrations where he would walk into like think tank meetings and like these government meetings. He even went into a meeting with Cheney once, and he brought in a vial and he said, this is anthrax stimulant. I snuck this past security. This is how
oh my God.
happen on you. There was another time where he throws an anthrax vial across the room with anthrax stimulant to a group full of people to scare them. And then another time, I guess, in front of journalists while talking about the magic of bioweapons, because he would talk about it almost like in this exciting childlike way, like a Mr. Wizard kind of way. And some of these, especially in the 90s, he's really excited about these things. He does a demonstration where he brings out one of those cartoon style, like garden plume things and starts pumping like spores into the air. And he's like, just so you guys know, if this was anthrax spores in the air right now, you'd all be dead within 24 hours. And there's like all these little, flakes of things floating around in the air in front of these journalists. And they're just like horrified. And they've written about this, in their interviews with him. So.
Yeah. And people, he didn't try to hide this thing. He was like, you shut down the bioweapons program and you like ruined my career, all this work I did all these years. And Whitney Webb's done really good work on Patrick Cadlick. There's a whole, yeah, we should dig into that more. And if you ever do more documentary on this stuff, Robbie, yeah, it
Well,
would.
Ken Alabic is another guy too that's also in Florida. So Stephen Hatfill and Ken Alabic had Florida properties, and he was also being looked at by the FBI really early on. I think after they had polygraphed Bill Patrick at some point. So those were like two main like famous like bioweapons insider guys who the FBI had apparently already cleared early on, and then Stephen Hatfill, was connected to that orbit, and that's I guess who they decided, out of the three of them, who was the most suspicious. But it's interesting to think, that they polygraphed this guy initially. Who polygraphed him? And you read interviews with him. I could see a guy like that, as Whitney has said, easily being able to pass a polygraph because he seems like a complete sociopath. I mean, so it doesn't even make a difference if you pass one or not.
Yeah, they're inadmissible in court for a reason. They're not really that reliable, especially if he's been a government. He probably knows how to. I mean, they've all been taught, or I guess so. They've been polygraphed before. I imagine they can develop strategies. It doesn't like a lie detector. It just shows whether you're nervous or not, right? Whether you're having an emotional reaction. If you're really a true believer, I don't know if that works on you, right?
Yeah,
you can be trained too. You can be trained too.
But I was always going to say, if we don't believe any of the official versions, the one thing that I remember thinking at the time, and even now when I'm looking at the timeline, because I'm pulling up the Patriot Act page, and it says past October 26th, when you guys were doing the timeline. Wasn't one theory, one speculation that this was kind of like a domestic terror? There's no evidence for this. I'm just saying, we're thinking about 20 years later, like that this was kind of like a scare the crap out of the legislators so they'll pass the Patriot Act.
Well, yeah, that was actually kind of like the liberal. I would say that a lot of more liberal people had that conspiracy theory in their mind who knew about it at the time. That seemed to line up. But I mean, if you actually look into the details of it, I mean, Leahy and Daschle weren't really, they weren't really anti-Patriot Act. All they asked for was like a slight delay so they can like discuss it longer or something.
They weren't moving fast enough.
That was probably bad enough, though.
Yeah, that was bad enough.
Yeah, I mean, but I tend to think that that's whoever did this probably wanted that to be to create some fear in that direction. There have been people who tried to link Stephen's death, and then I'm going to jump to Gumby after this to talk about AMI because there's a lot of interesting things there that we haven't talked about. But there's been people who have tried to link Robert Stevens' death to an infamous George W. Bush daughter's photo that was published in the National Enquirer with them falling down drunk, that was like published sometime in the early summer before 9/11. And there's no real connection to Robert Stevens there at all, just that he happened to work for the same media corporation. But that's
so he was killed in retaliation.
Yeah.
For that.
Yeah.
But there are some weird connections, like if we're looking at this as possible targeting, because basically the FBI's main catch-all theory is this cross-contamination theory that resulted in the deaths and the infections that we saw. The people they were like targeted to, Leahy, Daschle, like they didn't get directly sick. So the FBI is basically saying everybody who died and got sick, it was from this cross-contamination, sort of like random chance, from the letters. But we really don't know that. And I mean, I guess just back to Stevens really quick. I mean, the stuff I was finding in my map sort of bolsters some of the theories I think that Stevens might have actually been targeted. His proximity even to some of the 9/11 hijackers in Florida around the time, leading up to the anthrax attacks is quite odd. The real estate agent, Gloria Irish, who found the hijackers' apartments, her husband was actually Stevens' boss. And there's just strange connections there that I don't think we can rule out the idea that these people weren't randomly targeted. They might have actually been targeted, is what I'm saying. So,
yeah.
Oh. Go ahead, Gumby.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, with regard to AMI, which is American Media Incorporated, which owns basically every supermarket tabloid that was around in the 90s. I mean, the Inquirer, the Globe, the Star, Weekly World News, all of these were published by AMI. And there are like not official, but like speculative theories from like David Pecker, who owns AMI. He suggested that the name, I believe it was him who suggested the name, it seemed symbolic or something. And so that the terrorists, this was in the context of when it was still seen as it might have been foreign terrorists, that somehow it was symbolic. And then also that the Inquirer or the Star, one of them, had run a front page with Osama bin Laden's face that said wanted dead or alive, and alive was scratched out. And like this was, they had pissed off Osama bin Laden, so he sent anthrax to the AMI building. But the AMI targeting, if it was targeted, is an interesting angle to consider, because there's a whole kind of backstory to that publication in that building, which is that, I mean, it's kind of an involved story, but basically David Pecker, who had a pretty legit career in, I guess, kind of mainstream magazine media. He had run George, JFK Jr.'s publication, and he had run some other ones, including Trump Luxury or something, Trump Golf, some Trump publication. And he was very close with Trump. And if his name seems familiar, it's because it came out that he was basically doing catch and kill, paying to buy up stories and then bury them, including a story about from a stripper or porn star or something that
Karen McDougal.
What was that?
Was it the Karen McDougal?
Yeah, Karen McDougal. That she claimed that she had an affair with Trump and she was going to sell the story. And so the AMI bought exclusive rights to it and then just buried it. And it came out that Pecker has this vault of dirt on people, including apparently a lot of dirt on Trump, where he would do that. He would just buy us the exclusive rights to a story and then with no intention of publishing it, with actually the opposite. And it seems the broader point here is that it seems pretty likely, or there's strong evidence that is essentially the National Enquirer AMI business model for a long time. Going further back, I know Whitney was mentioning some stuff about the early ownership being connected to the whole kind of, mobbed up scene that
Pope.
She's written
about.
Yeah,
the original guy was the Pope who started. He was like an Italian American newspaper that was in Italian, and then he started it. So it was pretty corrupt from way back when.
Yeah.
Pecker, correct me if I'm wrong, Gumby, but wasn't Pecker brought down by the attempt to blackmail Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, Bezos and Zuckerberg, I think. Or
the affair. Remember, Bezos had an affair, and he said he actually said he had a picture of Bezos taking a picture of himself in the nude.
There was that, and Ronan, something to do with Ronan Farrow too. There was some story involving Ronan Farrow.
Yeah, there was one there, and then he had caught Bezos. This is why Jeff Bezos got divorced, in part.
Right.
That he was having an affair with this woman, and that he had somehow gotten access to like a dong pic and all these other things, and he had said to Bezos, "Get off our case, or I'm going to publish this." And Bezos instead went public. Yeah. And had I guess it was a Medium post, or I forget where he published it. Basically said I'm being extorted,
right,
by AMI.
Yeah, right? And so Pecker got pushed out, in last year. I mean, very recently. But he had owned it since he had taken over control of AMI when the National Enquirer was not doing that well, is my understanding, and had a very poor reputation, which is funny to say, but even worse, that. Nothing in it was true and it was totally ludicrous kind of stuff. Whereas it became more well, this is probably true, but it's just a rumor. Or
they got John Edwards. Kind of stuff. Remember that?
Exactly. They brought down John Edwards. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that they seem to be involved in this kind of building up dirt on people. And so the building, after the Stevens case comes out and Ernesto Blanco, their deaths, and the building is seen to be contaminated with anthrax. And so this guy comes in named David Rustine, who's a local real estate developer guy. I don't know a whole lot of history on him. And he buys this building, which is a pretty massive complex worth, millions of dollars, $15 million or something. I'm kind of pulling that out of the air, and buys it for $45,000. So basically for nothing. Now this is a building supposedly contaminated with anthrax, so he's got to deal with that, right?
He buys it from AMI, right?
Yes, AMI owned the building directly, is my understanding. And so he buys it, and he makes a deal with a company, a recently formed company, as I understand it, named Bio One. And Bio One was a newly formed combined joint venture between Sabre Technical Services, which had been involved in contaminating some of the anthrax infected buildings in DC, like the Hart Senate building and some of the other ones, I believe, and Rudy Giuliani's company, Giuliani Partners. So Giuliani gets involved in this deal, and it wasn't just a deal to clean up the building. What he actually did was he contracted them to clean out the building, and then made a lease deal with them. So once the building was cleaned out, Bio One, which was going to become this big, we're cleaning up hazardous sites kind of deal with Rudy Giuliani behind us, was going to take over that building, and it was going to become their new headquarters. And so in this deal, this is what I found in kind of looking through, because a lawsuit ends up developing around this. And the building actually, the Bio One comes in, they do their thing, which is basically just pumping the building full of like chlorine. That's really all they do. And it only takes like a day. And the Hart Senate building was only
the remediation for anthrax it can't be like that advanced, right?
It's not, but the sticking point was that AMI had this massive archive of like 5 million photographs, as well as clips, every back issue, a bunch of other articles, whatever else they had collected. I mean, they had a librarian on staff. This was a massive operation that going on down there. And so in the deal that they worked out, Rustine, the real estate developer, actually takes control of the personal property contained in the building as the terms of the sale from AMI. And so in the deal, AMI was apparently supposed to be allowed to go in. They could take whatever they want out, which doesn't make any sense if the building is supposedly contaminated, or destroy whatever they want. And then Rustine was going to take it all over with the intention, and this is pretty clear in the contract, that he was to destroy everything. So you have these 5 million photographs, dirt on everybody going back to the 70s, some of the biggest celebrities, power players, whatever, and they're going to destroy it all. It's all going to be destroyed per the terms of this sales contract. And so this created a big furor, because the actual photography companies and individual photographers who had taken these photos said, AMI doesn't own my original photo. I own it. I want control of it. And the specific one that there was a big lawsuit around was this photo of Elvis in his coffin, which was on the cover of National Enquirer in 1977 or 79, whenever Elvis died. And
what else can you add to this story? It's already, I'm sorry.
Right. This is insane.
So many more things can you? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, and so the Elvis photo, and this issue sold like 6.5 million copies. It was like, and the photo was valued at the original photo is valued at like $1 million or something. They like paid Elvis's boob cousin to sneak in and like take the photograph or whatever. Sorry, what were you saying, Robbie?
No, I was just saying it was like actually used as like this big thing where it was like, this is proof that Elvis is dead. Like he's not alive.
Yeah, so you can draw in that too, because a lot of people would analyze the photo for their like Elvis isn't dead, theories, and that it looks maybe. And actually, there was one that was kind of like, it did look a little bit like a composite
impossible exactly. Position or something.
Right. People would analyze it that way. And so this whole lawsuit really like stalls the entire operation, and they're not able to move forward because there's this dispute over what they're going to do with these photographs that are inside. They're saying they're contaminated, we can't do anything with them, and the other side is saying this other. But what comes out in the lawsuit is that apparently I have a thread where I pulled this photo, but it's a photo of AMI's lawyer in a hazmat suit with a Darth Vader type mask on the front, and he's holding up the Elvis photo, the Elvis coffin photo. And there's a dispute about the reason that he had sent this photo to, I think he sent it to the lawyer for Sabre or Bio One or whatever. I'm not remembering that part exactly.
He's mailing anthrax laden material.
Well, he's scanning this photo of himself holding the photo in, and one side was claiming that this was like an extortion mechanism because they hadn't the payment hadn't happened or something, and I'm not remembering the details, but basically that like they were saying we found the photograph, we have it, like holding the photo hostage. And the other side, basically AMI, was saying no, we had authorized the shredding of this photo, and this $1 million photograph, original photo, was shredded right after he took this photo of himself holding the photo. And basically the I can't remember even really the what happened at the end of this lawsuit, except that basically it created this huge debacle with Bio One, where Bio One never got paid for their job because of this whole dispute about the photographs, and so they backed out of the deal to take over the building. And this other company was brought in. Who, do you remember the name of that one, Robbie?
Yeah, well, this is the weird part is David Rustine has a family connection to this company, Marcor Remediation. Do you want to mention that?
Wait, does David Rustine have a connection to Marcor?
Yeah, David Rustine, his family is in Marcor, and Marcor Remediation happens to be one of the main companies that clean up the World Trade Center crime scene. Oh, yeah, right. So it appears that David Rustine already had a connection to, in some weird way, the 9/11 crime scene. His family, someone in his family was part of this business. Sorry.
No, that was good because I was forgetting about that piece for sure. So basically they come in and they take over the cleanup job, which really had already been done. I mean, Bio One had already pumped in the chlorine and all that. And at the end of the day, the photos are either destroyed, or if anything of value was taken out, nobody really knows about it. I mean, it's not, they haven't emerged like secret photos or anything. And the building still stays closed for a number of years after that. I don't think it reopened until like 2011 or something like that. I mean, well after all of this had gone down. And it's unrelated companies in there now. There's like an airplane parts supply company or something. I haven't looked into them specifically to see if it's shady or anything. But anyway, this is this very bizarre story. And I guess if one were to develop a theory around this, that AMI was targeted for a particular reason, might that reason be that it was to get rid of or to suppress the stuff that was in this archive, to basically, completely trash, or be able to pull out, under the shroud of this, chaos, pull out the dirt that you want to keep and get rid of the rest. And, may this be some reason that AMI was in the mix here? And that's more of a speculative theory than anything, but
I think there's plenty of evidence to bolster that. I mean, just in addition to what Gumby said, there's plenty of evidence to bolster the idea that AMI at least was directly targeted for that reason. And that there's actually a weird connection, Gumby. I don't know if you mentioned this, that Robert Stevens is actually credited as being a photo touch-up editor of the Elvis coffin photo. So
right. No, I didn't. Yeah.
Extemporaneous way. That's how he's just randomly connected to this weird string of events that Gumby's been talking about. That doesn't mean he was targeted because of that. It's just a weird connection to him directly. It's the only connection really, that you can even find to this whole narrative. But what's really bizarre is that David Pecker, the owner of AMI, actually was able to wield this incredible amount of power against the FBI. Imagine right after 9/11, it's the Bush administration Justice Department. They ran in there roughshod. It's like to think that someone like David Pecker could basically tell them, you know what, you can only come and search the building if I get basically a written statement from you guys saying that you will let me block you from any area of the AMI building or block you from taking any files in the AMI building that I don't want you to because of journalistic integrity and privacy. So the FBI basically went full cuck mode and signed on this piece of paper to him, basically saying that they're going to agree with David Pecker that they will not have like unfettered access to this crime scene, which strangely they did not want to go to until I think December 2002 or August 2002. That's almost a year after this happened. Why would the FBI wait so long to even go back there? And then in addition to that, never even really get full access to the scene. They let David Pecker control the situation. And apparently this was all sort of brokered via Jeb Bush. He came down and had a meeting with David Pecker, the FBI heads at the time. I think Senator Bill Nelson of Florida, and they sort of all worked this out. And at the end of all this, David Pecker was actually hedging on Jeb Bush, sort of pulling strings and getting Jeb Bush to pay for remediation of the building and sort of, pay him back. He would even sort of like do this woe is me thing where David Pecker would go around saying like, I was one of the only people who lost someone. Like I lost Robert Stevens. And he'd be like, why don't I get paid back for this, by like Jeb Bush basically. And so he grew more bitter towards Jeb over time. But there's also evidence that suggests that while David Pecker had control over American Media Inc., he's basically like the Rupert Murdoch of America at that point. I mean, all these grocery store tabloids, he cleared a lane for Jeb Bush during all of these like adultery scandals that he had in the early 2000s and late 90s, where I guess it seemed like they had this kind of gentlemanly agreement where I guess Jeb Bush's kids would get savaged in the tabloids, but then Jeb Bush's like extramarital affairs were like never mentioned in the tabloids. And again, just like Gumby was suggesting, there was a catch and kill operation, but there was also sort of these lower level, more like agreements. Like when he helped basically Arnold Schwarzenegger become governor, he wiped the tabloids clean of like any negative Arnold Schwarzenegger stories for that like 6-week window when Arnold Schwarzenegger ran during the recall. And it was right after David Pecker was arranging a deal to buy basically like the muscle and fitness media empire. And the guy who owned that empire was the guy who brought Arnold Schwarzenegger to the United States. So it's like, it's weird to think that this guy whose net worth is $10 million was basically wielding all this power. And the Bush administration's, Justice Department was like, sure, you can, we're not going to badger you to look through the whole AMI building. It's fine. Like you can just let us take what you want us to take. And it's cool. I mean, so that's actually documented in Robert Graysmith's Anthrax book that happened.
But the larger point, which is that like they would have been targeted by a hostile foreign terrorist or foreign government in the case of Iraq, I guess. That's completely out of step with the FBI's theory, which is that it was this guy Ivins. So, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't even make sense on its own terms. Like let's say you buy the FBI's official theory, it's this guy Ivins. Why is he upset about a Bin Laden cover? Like, is he that media savvy, this lab geek, that he's going to do a kind of a bank shot at the authority by hitting? You know what I mean? Like, the more you look about it, the more it doesn't seem to make sense, right?
Yeah, and I think that I don't remember exactly. I think that may have come from Pecker himself. As like, here's the speculation about
they hate us for our freedoms.
Yeah, basically. Okay. And it's funny. I know Robbie has a copy of this, but there's they released an issue after the Anthrax attack on the building, and after the story had all come out, and the cover is something like Anthrax. I don't know, Anthrax attack here or whatever. And they have a little banner at the top that says "Not published in Florida," because Pecker apparently was afraid, or that he felt that like people wouldn't buy the copy because they'd be afraid that spores of anthrax would be, embedded on the paper itself. So he had to make sure that everybody realized like this wasn't not printed in that building. It wasn't printed anywhere in Florida, so it couldn't possibly have tiny minuscule spores of anthrax that were going to infect you or something.
He knows his audience.
Yeah, it does speak to the kind of the terror and fear at the time, though, that would even be a thought that anybody would ever do that or would think that I could pick up the National Enquirer and get anthrax from it. I mean, that shows you how deeply embedded it was in people's consciousness, I think.
It definitely was. I remember it being that way. I think we should probably wrap up. I feel like we're really not finished this conversation.
No, we haven't gotten to what you think happened. We're just going over all the details. So that'll be the next part, I guess. What do you actually think happened, not how ludicrous the FBI's official theory is, which is, as
I also
can tell you, quite ludicrous.
Right. And I also like the sort of your biggest questions aspect of it too. You know, it's interesting to hear what different people's biggest the things that bother them the most or whatever. So I'm kind of hoping that you guys will agree to come back and continue this session in the not too distant future, maybe within a week or something like that, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
Yep, sure.
Just wanted to preview that MediaRoots Radio, the podcast I do, we have an episode coming out in a couple of days that's going into a lot of the details in the Kathy Nguyen case, the fourth anthrax victim, the fourth murder. And I pulled up something that I think is pretty intriguing, where the FBI at one time was actually saying that she might have been one of the terrorists involved in the attacks. They were, for some reason, smearing, out of all the anthrax victims, they decided to insinuate things about her. And there's also a climate that there's a lot of clues there too, that like she led such a private life that for some reason, even the CDC was sort of putting out these like sleeper cell insinuations about her. And I think when you really think about the climate after 9/11, you have to imagine what didn't take that much insinuation to make someone think that you're alluding that they could be a terrorist. And the government did that about her. And I think that's rather strange. And I go over basically the whole FBI case file when it has to do with Florida and her, and just sort of show how, it doesn't line up with basically the case they're making overall. And, not just the case they're making against Bruce Ivins, but this idea that these were like, 5 letters that had all these random victims. So I hope, your listeners check that out as well.
Yeah, I'll make sure to get all the links from you on all the relevant things. Our last episode I think it had like 29 or 30 links in the show notes. So plenty for people to dig into. So anyway, thank you so much.
Hole, folks.
Yeah. So to be continued, and thanks so much, everybody. Look forward to continuing this with you soon.
All right, thanks.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Dan Wright, to Gumby, Peter Castagno, and Robbie Martin. Follow myself, Joanne Leon, on Twitter. Follow Dan at Dan S. Wright. Follow Gumby at Gumby for Christ. Follow Peter at Peter Castagno. And follow Robbie at Fluorescent Gray. This podcast is fully independent media. Listener support, really important. Rockfin.com/AroundTheEmpire, Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. You can find the podcast on any mobile podcast app. You can find everything you need on the most up-to-date things at AroundTheEmpire.com. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on the video platforms. Right now that's Rockfin, Patreon, and YouTube. Follow on Twitter at AroundTheEmpire, and join us on Telegram, t.me/AroundTheEmpire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.